Everyone thought they knew how the future of the monarchy would unfold. King Charles, then Prince William. But behind palace walls, Queen Elizabeth left behind a secret that no one saw coming. A private letter, hidden from the public, has now been revealed by Princess Anne, and it changes everything. The name in that letter wasn't Charles or William, it was Catherine. Most of the world believed the future of the British monarchy was set in stone. First King Charles, then Prince William. Neat, orderly, traditional. But late one foggy night inside Buckingham Palace, everything changed. It started with Princess Anne, the royal who had always been the quiet constant. Dependable, sharp, never one to stir headlines. But for years, Anne had been carrying a secret, a letter from her mother, Queen Elizabeth II, a personal message not shared with courtiers or advisors. It wasn't written for public eyes, it was written for her. That night, Anne decided the time had come. She summoned King Charles and Prince William to a private room. No aides, no cameras, just the three of them. The room was dim and heavy with silence. Velvet curtains drawn, portraits of past monarchs watching from every wall. Anne didn't make a speech. She simply opened her purse, pulled out a worn envelope, and placed it on the table. Charles opened it first. His hands trembled. William leaned in, his face tight with confusion. They both read the same words, twice, 3 times. The Queen's letter did not name Charles as the one to carry the crown forward. It didn't even name William. Instead, it named someone unexpected, someone who had not been born royal, but had earned the people's trust and admiration over time. It named Catherine. Queen Elizabeth believed the future of the monarchy wasn't about bloodlines anymore. It was about connection, trust, and modern strength. In her eyes, Catherine, the Princess of Wales, represented all of it, not as a consort, but as the key to the monarchy's survival. Anne watched their reactions. Charles looked stunned. William was silent, unreadable. The letter lay between them like a spark no one dared touch. The Queen's final wish had just been spoken, and nothing in that palace would ever be the same again. The silence in the room was suffocating. The letter sat between them like a ghost. King Charles stared at the table, his fingers still lightly brushing the edges of the paper. William sat motionless, fists slowly clenching and unclenching in his lap. And Princess Anne. She didn't flinch. She had known this moment would come. She had prepared for it, even if the others hadn't. Charles finally broke the silence. "This isn't how it's done," he said, his voice low and hoarse, more to himself than anyone else. He looked older in that moment, less like a monarch, more like a man trying to reconcile duty with something deeply personal. Anne didn't speak right away. She let the weight of the letter linger. When she did speak, it was calm, steady. She didn't want this broadcasted. She left it for me, knowing I'd wait for the right time. William finally looked up. His eyes were unreadable, but something sharp flickered in them. "Why not tell us earlier?" Anne gave a sad, almost knowing smile. "Because you weren't ready to hear it." It wasn't an accusation. It was a truth, and it landed hard. William turned back toward the letter, reading it again, slower this time. The Queen hadn't named Catherine to embarrass anyone. She hadn't meant to overturn tradition for the sake of shock. She had seen what others had missed or ignored. Catherine wasn't just respected, she was trusted, not just by the public, but by Elizabeth herself. Charles stood up and walked toward the window, fog pressing against the glass outside. "People will think this is madness," he muttered. "A consort, as heir?" Anne didn't argue. She wasn't here to convince anyone. She had fulfilled her mother's last request. What came next wasn't hers to decide. The silence returned, heavier now, because all three knew. This letter didn't just suggest a future, it demanded a choice. And no matter what they decided next, the monarchy would never return to what it had been. Outside, London slept, but inside Buckingham Palace, the winds were changing. While 3 of the most powerful royals in Britain sat in tense silence upstairs, Catherine, the woman at the center of it all, had no idea. Down the hall, in a quieter wing of the palace, she had just finished putting Prince George, Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis to bed. She moved with her usual calm, the steady rhythm of motherhood grounding her. A cup of tea sat cooling beside her as she looked out the window, unaware of the storm unfolding just a few floors above. There was no speech prepared, no sense of destiny stirring in her chest. Catherine wasn't thinking about crowns or councils. She was thinking about her children, about tomorrow's schedule, and whether she'd have time to finish replying to letters from the charities she supported. That was who she was, always present, never presumptuous. But something tugged at her, a restlessness, a quiet hum of something unseen. She didn't know it yet, but her name, her very future, was being debated in a room thick with history and pressure. Upstairs, the Queen's letter lay on the table like a spark waiting for fire. Downstairs, the woman it named sat alone, framed by moonlight and fog, sipping tea that had gone cold. She had never sought power. From the very beginning, Catherine had simply wanted to do her part, to serve the crown, to support William, to protect her children. And that was exactly what Queen Elizabeth had seen in her. A rare blend of humility and strength. A modern royal who didn't chase attention, but commanded it nonetheless. Back in the meeting room, Anne stood. "We have a decision to make," she said quietly, "and pretending this letter doesn't exist isn't one of the options." No one answered, but something had shifted. A door had opened that could never be closed again. And in another part of the palace, Catherine sat still by the window, not knowing the course of her life, and the future of the monarchy had already begun to change. Queen Elizabeth had ruled longer than any monarch in British history. She had seen wars, scandals, abdications, and upheavals. But through it all, she never once let the public see her uncertainty. That was the monarch's burden, to carry doubt in private, while offering certainty in public. But in her final years, when the world outside the palace began to shift faster than tradition could follow, the Queen made a decision few expected. She wrote a letter, not to her heirs, but to her daughter, Anne. In that letter, the Queen didn't discuss the economy, foreign policy, or the line of succession. She spoke, instead of legacy, of survival, of the people's trust, and most striking of all, she wrote of Catherine, not as a daughter-in-law or a consort, but as the future. Elizabeth had seen it long before anyone else did. Where others saw duty, Catherine brought warmth. Where others followed protocol, she brought presence. The Queen believed that while kings might inherit power, it was Catherine who had inherited something far rarer: public faith. She had observed Catherine closely over the years, watched her navigate press scrutiny with grace, raise her children with care, and carry the weight of royal expectations without letting it harden her. Catherine had not been born into royalty, but she had become royal in the way that truly mattered: in spirit, in service, and in how the people saw her. The Queen knew that succession laws couldn't be rewritten with a letter. That wasn't the point. The letter was not a legal document. It was a moral compass, a final nudge toward a future that might actually endure. She trusted Anne to deliver it when the moment came, not because Anne was the loudest voice, but because she was the most loyal, the most measured. And now that letter lay on a table at the heart of Buckingham Palace, daring a new generation to see what Elizabeth had seen. Not the past, not tradition, but a future with Catherine at its center. By morning, the fog over London hadn't lifted. Neither had the tension inside Buckingham Palace. A second, more formal meeting had been arranged, this time including senior royals and trusted advisors. It had been hastily called, but nothing about it felt routine. The air buzzed with nerves, whispers, and the silent weight of something seismic brewing beneath tradition. Princess Anne was the first to arrive. She didn't come dressed for battle, but there was steel in her spine. In her hand, she carried a simple leather folder, the Queen's letter, folded with care. She didn't look around for approval. She walked to the center of the room and placed it on the long mahogany table, the same one where generations of royal decisions had been made. "This is Her Majesty's final wish," she said firmly. "Not mine, not Charles's, not William's, Hers. The room went still. King Charles entered next, his usual composed expression barely hiding the tension in his jaw. And finally, Prince William walked in, tall, regal, and silent, though his eyes betrayed the storm behind them. As they each took their seats, Anne unfolded the letter again. Its contents were no longer a secret, but the reality of its implications had begun to sink in. One by one, they read the Queen's elegant handwriting. It wasn't emotional. It was clear, deliberate, and final. Catherine was the future, not just as consort, as something more. Gasps, murmurs. One advisor leaned back, stunned. Another leaned forward, visibly shaken. Charles slammed a hand on the table. "This is madness," he said, his voice tight. "I thought last night was a joke. Succession can't just be rewritten." Anne held his gaze, unwavering. Mother wasn't confused. She was certain. Then William spoke finally. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the room. "And what about me?" A beat of silence. Anne didn't answer with pity. She answered with truth. "You're still vital. You're still needed. But to survive, the monarchy must evolve." Mother saw that. She wanted us to see it too. No one had expected this meeting, and now no one would ever forget it. Prince William had trained his whole life for one role, to become king. He had studied the crown's history, walked in the Queen's shadow, and built a life that mirrored royal expectations. Every step, every speech, every smile had been carefully measured, not just for the public, but for the future he believed was already his. But now, everything had shifted. The Queen, his grandmother, his mentor, had chosen someone else to carry the soul of the monarchy forward. And that someone was his wife. William sat quietly as the room buzzed with uncertainty. His jaw was tight, eyes fixed on the table, trying to absorb what this meant, not just for the crown, but for him, for his identity, for everything he thought he understood. He loved Catherine. That was never the question. But this felt like betrayal, not by her, but by fate, by legacy, by the expectations that had been tattooed into his life from the moment he was born. He finally stood up and walked to the fireplace, hands gripping the mantle. "She didn't ask for this," he said, not turning around. "She never wanted power." Anne's voice came softly behind him. "That's exactly why she's the one." William closed his eyes. He could feel the truth in that. He had watched Catherine walk through fire, the media, the pressure, the scrutiny, and never once stumble. She wasn't just respected, she was loved. And the worst part? He wasn't sure he would have survived the same storm. He looked back at the table, at the letter that had detonated his world. "All this time," he said, "was I not enough?" "No," Anne said gently. "You've always been enough. But this isn't about worth. It's about timing, about survival." And suddenly, the question changed. It wasn't "why her" anymore. It was, "can I let go of what I expected to protect what we still have?" Because William understood something deeper than anyone else in the room. If the monarchy was going to stand, it couldn't just rely on bloodlines anymore. It needed belief. And the people believed in Catherine. Even if it broke him, he couldn't deny that truth. While Buckingham Palace held its breath behind velvet curtains and closed doors, the world outside kept turning, unaware that the royal family's foundations were quietly shifting beneath their feet. No headlines, no statements, no breaking news alerts. The public saw the usual: Catherine at charity visits, offering warm smiles and kind words. William standing tall beside her, shaking hands, attending ceremonies. The illusion of order held firm. But beneath the surface, a storm had already begun to brew. Catherine continued her work with grace. She spent mornings in children's hospitals, afternoons meeting with mental health organizations, and evenings with her family. She wore the crown lightly, even when she didn't know it was beginning to form around her. She hadn't been told what had happened that foggy night. No one had spoken the Queen's letter aloud to her, but instinctively, Catherine sensed a shift in the way William watched her, in the way King Charles fell silent when she entered a room, in the way Anne stood a little closer than before. Meanwhile, rumors started to ripple through the palace halls, whispers among staff, nervous glances between aides. Something was happening, and soon it would leak. The tabloids caught scent of it first. Unrest behind royal walls. One headline read, "Kate's quiet rise," another speculated. No one knew the truth, but everyone sensed it. The old certainty of the monarchy was cracking, and something new was trying to push through. At state dinners and public engagements, Charles wore the crown, but it no longer seemed to fit. The weight of history pressed down on him, and though he stood with dignity, it was clear. He was a man out of step with the moment. And William? He played his role, but each bow, each speech, each smile was delivered with a growing heaviness. He wasn't just carrying his own legacy anymore, he was carrying the growing knowledge that the people may already have chosen someone else. Still, no one said it aloud, not yet, because in the world outside the palace, traditions still reigned, but inside, change had already come. Buckingham Palace had stood for centuries, a symbol of permanence, of tradition that would never bend. But now, after Queen Elizabeth's death, even its stone walls seemed to carry a different weight. What once felt unshakable had begun to tremble. For years, the monarchy survived by clinging to its rituals. But the modern world wasn't waiting. Outside the palace, people were asking new questions. Was the monarchy still relevant? Did it still matter? And more importantly, who among the royals still held the public's trust? King Charles's reign was official. He wore the crown, spoke from the throne, and led with the dignity of a man who had waited a lifetime for this moment. But for all his preparation, something was missing. Connection. He was respected, yes, but not beloved. The scars of the past still clung to him. The collapse of his marriage to Diana, the long and controversial road with Camilla, the decades of tabloid headlines. They had shaped the public's view in ways no coronation could erase. And for William, the burden was even more complex. On paper, he was the perfect heir, young enough to bridge generations, polished enough to lead, but he was stuck in a role that no longer held the same certainty. The ground beneath him had shifted, because no matter how hard he worked, the spotlight had found Catherine, and the world wasn't looking away. Polls began to reflect the change. Support for the monarchy among younger generations was slipping. In Australia, the Caribbean, and parts of the Commonwealth, calls to cut ties with the crown grew louder, and inside the UK, the once automatic loyalty was being replaced by curiosity, doubt, and preference. People weren't just following titles anymore. They were following values, presence, humanity, and Catherine, quietly, consistently, had become the face they trusted most. No royal decree had been issued, no succession had been altered, but the unspoken truth was growing harder to ignore. The House of Windsor wasn't just facing change, it was standing on a fault line, one that could no longer be hidden beneath crowns and ceremony. As whispers of the Queen's letter and Catherine's possible future spread beyond palace walls, something unexpected happened. The world turned its gaze back, not forward, back to where Catherine had come from. She wasn't born into royalty. There were no titles in her childhood home, no castles, no line of succession. She was Catherine Elizabeth Middleton, the daughter of a flight dispatcher and a former flight attendant, a middle-class girl from Berkshire who grew up in a loving, grounded household. But now, with her name tied to a potential royal revolution, the public and the press wanted to know more. Who was the woman Queen Elizabeth had quietly chosen as the future? What they found surprised even her critics. Catherine's life was marked by quiet strength and steady work. As a child, she had moved with her family to Jordan when her father took a job with British Airways. She adapted to a new culture, learned early to carry herself with grace and curiosity. Later, back in England, she attended St. Andrews and then Marlborough College, where she stood out, not for privilege, but for leadership and resilience. She wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but she was often the one people turned to. In her gap year, Catherine volunteered in Chile, trekked through the wilderness, worked on community projects, and studied art in Florence. She returned to the UK to attend the University of St. Andrews, where of course she met Prince William. But even then, she was cautious, grounded. She didn't chase him. They became friends before they became anything more. And when fame found her, she didn't flinch. She took the press heat, the cruel nicknames, the endless speculation, and through it all, she never lashed out, never lost control. She simply kept showing up, stronger, steadier, and more composed than anyone expected. Now, with the Queen's blessing tied to her name, critics had to pause. They found no scandals, no missteps, only a woman who had spent her entire adult life proving she belonged, without ever demanding that she did. And that, perhaps, was exactly why Queen Elizabeth chose her. Not for her crown, but for her character. To the outside world, Catherine had always been composed, polished, serene, almost impossibly perfect. But beneath the elegant gowns, the soft voice, and the constant camera flashes, there was something far more powerful: quiet resilience. It was that quality, the kind that doesn't make headlines, that Queen Elizabeth had recognized. A different kind of strength, one that didn't roar but held steady through storm after storm. From the moment she entered royal life, Catherine was tested by the media, by tradition, by the sheer weight of expectations that had broken others before her. Yet she never crumbled. She adapted. She listened. She learned. And when necessary, she stood her ground, with grace, not defiance. She didn't just marry into the royal family, she worked to become part of it. Not by reinventing herself, but by becoming more of who she already was: compassionate, curious, quietly confident. Her charity work wasn't performative. Long before the Queen's letter was even imagined, Catherine was sitting on the floors of hospices with terminally ill children. She was working on early childhood development, mental health awareness, addiction recovery. She didn't need to be the face of every cause. She just needed to make a difference. And behind palace doors, she was just as present, raising her children without full-time nannies, ensuring they had as normal a life as royalty could allow, choosing school drop-offs over press events, bedtime stories over black tie galas when it mattered most. It wasn't that Catherine didn't want to lead. It was that she understood leadership wasn't about control, it was about service. That was the legacy Queen Elizabeth had spent a lifetime building, not one of dominance, but of duty. And in Catherine, she had seen not just a reflection of that ideal, but an evolution of it. She didn't ask for the spotlight, and yet it always found her. And when it did, she never let it burn her. This was the strength that no one had anticipated. The strength that didn't shout, but endured. The kind of strength a fractured monarchy needed now more than ever. And the Queen had seen it, quietly and clearly, before anyone else had dared to look. Inside Buckingham Palace, the silence had become a presence of its own. Days had passed since Anne read the Queen's letter aloud, and yet no public move had been made. No press release, no official comment. But something had shifted. The senior royals, Charles, William, Anne, continued their duties. Public smiles, formal handshakes, carefully prepared speeches. The facade held. But behind the scenes, the weight of the Queen's words lingered like a ghost in every room they entered. And then something happened. A small leak, a whisper in the press, a headline too carefully worded to be coincidence. Queen's final wish may involve surprising royal favorite. It wasn't confirmation, but it was a spark, and in a family where even silence can be strategy, it was enough to ignite speculation. The public responded, not with outrage, but curiosity. Could Catherine truly be the future? And quietly, without fanfare, something else happened too. William changed. He became more measured in public, more contemplative. His speeches felt less scripted, more grounded. Observers noticed the difference, and behind closed doors, He and Catherine began having longer, deeper conversations. She hadn't asked to be named, but now that she had been, they both understood. This was no longer just about them. It was about legacy. William's internal struggle hadn't disappeared, but something had settled. He had watched Catherine carry herself with integrity, even under impossible scrutiny. He had seen the Queen's quiet wisdom reflected in her choice, and he realized that the greatest act of leadership might not be stepping forward, but making space. He began to support her in small, powerful ways, letting her take the lead during engagements, deferring to her in meetings, seeking her input more often and more openly. It wasn't submission, it was recognition. Recognition that Catherine didn't want power, but she had earned something greater: trust. This shift wasn't public yet. It didn't need to be. Inside the palace, those who mattered saw it, and so did Catherine. She saw her husband, no longer just the heir, but a man who understood what it meant to lead beside someone, not in front of them. This was the turning point, not with a crown, but with quiet agreement. For weeks, Catherine said nothing. Not to the press, not to the public, not even to her closest aides. Behind palace walls, the Queen's final wish had set off waves that could not be seen but were deeply felt. Catherine remained at the center of it, graceful, quiet, unwavering. And still, the one question loomed over everyone. Would she accept? It wasn't a throne being offered. Not technically. The line of succession was untouched. But everyone inside the palace knew that this was something far more difficult to accept. It was a responsibility born of trust, not law, of legacy, not lineage. And then, one evening, Catherine answered. She didn't gather cameras or issue a statement. Instead, she invited only 3 people to join her in the same room where Anne had first unfolded the Queen's letter: King Charles, Prince William, and Princess Anne. The room was still. Catherine stood. "I know what's being asked of me," she said softly. "And I'm honored, but I'm also a mother, a wife, and I will never choose the crown over my family. If I do this, it will be on terms that protect them, not just tradition." There was silence. William looked at her with something deeper than love: respect. He nodded. Charles leaned back in his chair, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. Anne, standing beside the mantel, didn't speak. She didn't need to. Catherine continued. "This isn't about changing the line. This is about meeting the moment. If I can help carry this, help guide it, I will, but not alone." It wasn't a yes, and it wasn't a no. It was something stronger. It was Catherine drawing her own line in the sand, not for power, but for purpose. From that moment on, the palace began to change again, not in structure, but in spirit. Subtly, Catherine's presence was amplified. She led more engagements. She spoke more freely. She was no longer just supporting the monarchy, she was helping shape it. And the people noticed. The Queen's final wish had not crowned Catherine, but it had revealed her, not as the next queen by blood, but as the Queen of Hearts and the future. The monarchy didn't change overnight. There were no fireworks, no royal declarations, just a letter, a choice, and a woman who never asked to lead, but proved she could. As the world watches what comes next, one truth remains clear. The future of the crown may no longer rest on tradition alone, but on the quiet strength of those who never sought it.